Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you inspiring tales that touch the heart and ignite change. Today, we share the extraordinary journey of Henry, a humble farmer who dared to dream big. When he walked into a luxurious showroom to purchase a jet, he faced prejudice and scorn, but with unshakable determination and the power of resilience, Henry showed the world that dignity and self-worth triumph over judgment and discrimination. Stay with us as we delve into this powerful story of courage and justice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey. It was a crisp spring morning when Henry arrived at the Atlanta Aviation Showroom, a place he had only seen in glossy advertisements and television shows. The sky above was a perfect expanse of blue, as if urging him forward on this long-anticipated day. Dressed in his well-worn boots, a faded plaid shirt, and his favorite cap, Henry stepped out of his old pickup truck, taking in the sprawling building in front of him. Its modern glass facade gleamed in the sunlight, almost too polished for a man like him, a farmer whose hands were roughened by years of toil. Henry paused for a moment, leaning against his truck, clutching the envelope in his hand. Inside was the culmination of a lifetime of hard work, sweat, and sacrifices, a check that represented not just money, but his unyielding belief that a dream, no matter how distant, was worth pursuing. Today, he was going to buy a private jet. It was a dream born from endless days under the blazing sun on his ranch, imagining a different kind of freedom. For years, he'd saved every penny, knowing this moment would come. With a deep breath, Henry walked toward the showroom. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of leather and fresh polish. Rows of sleek aircraft stood on display, their metallic surfaces gleaming under bright spotlights. Each plane seemed like a testament to human ambition and ingenuity. But for Henry, they represented something more, a gateway to new horizons. A declaration of his success against all odds. As he stepped onto the polished marble floor, the sound of his boots echoed in the expansive space. Heads turned almost instantly. The salespeople, dressed impeccably in tailored suits, exchanged glances. Customers, adorned in designer clothes, cast quick, dismissive looks in his direction. Henry wasn't oblivious to the whispers, the sneers, or the subtle curling of lips into condescending smirks. He wasn't the kind of person they expected to see in a place like this. One man, standing near the reception desk, leaned toward his companion. "What's he doing here?" he whispered, loud enough for Henry to hear. "Looks like he walked straight off a farm." Henry's grip on the envelope tightened. He kept walking, forcing himself to meet their judgmental stares with quiet resolve. He wasn't here to please them or seek their approval. He was here for himself. And that knowledge kept him moving. As he approached one of the aircraft, his steps slowed. It was a mid-sized jet, its design sleek yet elegant. Henry reached out, running his hand gently along its surface. The cold, smooth metal sent a shiver up his spine. But it wasn't just the touch that affected him, it was what the plane symbolized. This wasn't just an airplane. It was proof of everything he had worked for, of every early morning, late night, and sacrifice he had endured. This was his dream made real. But his quiet moment of awe was interrupted by the sound of deliberate footsteps. Henry turned to see a young man approaching. His hair was slicked back, his suit crisply pressed, and his expression carried an air of self-assured authority. His name tag read Brad. As he stopped in front of Henry, Brad crossed his arms, his smirk revealing an immediate lack of respect. "Excuse me," Brad said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Henry met Brad's gaze, unflinching. He didn't answer immediately, letting the words hang in the air. Brad's eyes swept over him, from the faded cap on his head to the mud-smeared boots on his feet. Before he continued, "This is an airplane showroom," Brad said, tilting his head slightly, "not a gas station." The insult was sharp, blatant, and hung heavily in the air. Nearby, a woman in an elegant dress stifled a laugh, while another customer leaned toward his friend, whispering something that drew a chuckle. Henry clenched his jaw, his hand still resting on the jet. The urge to respond, to lash out, bubbled within him, but he swallowed it down. He knew better. Losing his temper would only confirm their assumptions about him. Brad, emboldened by Henry's silence, took another step closer. "I think you might be more comfortable at the used car lot down the street," he said, his smirk widening. "You know, something more, your speed." Henry straightened his shoulders. His silence wasn't weakness, and he refused to let it be mistaken for such. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And I have every right to be here." The calm confidence in his voice seemed to unsettle Brad, if only for a moment. But the young salesman quickly recovered. "Do you even want to know the price of this jet?" Brad asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's not something you just buy with pocket change. You know." Henry didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the jet, his fingers tracing its lines with quiet reverence. He wasn't here to justify himself to Brad or anyone else. But as the stares and whispers around him grew louder, one thought echoed in his mind: was it enough to believe in yourself when the world around you didn't? As Henry stood there, absorbing the weight of their judgment, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "Henry, is that you?" He turned to see a man walking toward him, a warm smile lighting up his face. It was David, an old friend from high school. David's tailored suit and confident stride contrasted sharply with Henry's modest appearance. But his smile carried none of the disdain that filled the room. "What are you doing here?" David asked, clapping a hand on Henry's shoulder. Henry's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Trying to make a dream come true," he said quietly. David looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Let's make sure no one gets in your way." Henry felt a surge of relief as David's presence seemed to soften the oppressive atmosphere in the showroom. For a moment, the stares and whispers felt less suffocating. David, with his easy confidence and supportive demeanor, acted as a shield against the judgment radiating from the others. David glanced around, quickly taking in the situation, the sneering expressions, the dismissive salespeople, and Brad, who still stood nearby, his smirk faltering slightly as he recognized that Henry was no longer alone. Turning back to Henry, David gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "So, which one are you looking at?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the surrounding people to hear. "This one," Henry said, motioning to the sleek jet he'd been admiring. His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of vulnerability that only David could catch. David stepped closer to the jet, running his hand along its polished surface. "Good choice," he said with a nod. "This is a solid model, reliable, efficient, and perfect for someone who values practicality and craftsmanship." He spoke with the authority of someone who knew the industry, which made Brad's next words all the more jarring. "Right," Brad interjected, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Perfect for someone like him." "Huh." He gestured toward Henry, as if inviting David to share in the joke. But David's expression hardened, and the smile vanished from his face. "Someone like him?" David repeated, his voice cool and sharp. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Brad hesitated for a moment, but his arrogance quickly resurfaced. "Come on," he said, spreading his arms in a mock gesture of innocence. "Look at him. Does he really seem like someone who can afford a jet? I mean, no offense, but this isn't exactly a farmer's market." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. A few customers shifted awkwardly, while others seemed eager to see how the exchange would play out. Henry's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, David stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Listen carefully," David said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of anger. "What you just said is not only disrespectful. It's unprofessional. You don't know anything about this man, his work, his sacrifices, or his worth. And yet, you think you have the right to judge him based on how he looks. That's not just arrogance, it's prejudice." Brad's smirk faltered, and a faint flush crept up his neck. But instead of backing down, he crossed his arms and tilted his head. "I'm just being realistic," he said defensively. "It's not my fault if he doesn't fit the profile of a typical buyer." David shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and disappointment flashing across his face. "You're right about one thing," he said. "Henry doesn't fit the profile you've created in your narrow mind. But let me tell you something, he doesn't need to. The only thing that matters is whether he has the means and the determination to make this purchase. And he does." Henry felt a swell of gratitude for David's words. But he also knew that this was a battle he needed to fight himself. Placing a hand on David's arm, he stepped forward, locking eyes with Brad. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. "I came here to buy a plane, and whether you like it or not, I have every right to be here. So if you can't treat me with the respect any customer deserves, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong in this showroom." The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Brad opened his mouth to respond. But before he could say anything, an older man in a grey suit, the manager, judging by his demeanor, approached. He had likely overheard the exchange and now looked between Henry and Brad with a furrowed brow. "What seems to be the problem here?" the manager asked, his tone neutral but his expression wary. Before Brad could speak, David stepped in. "The problem," he said, his voice measured, "is that your salesman seems to think he can decide who does and doesn't deserve to be here based on their appearance. My friend Henry came here as a serious buyer. But instead of being treated with professionalism, he's been met with insults and condescension." The manager's expression darkened, and he turned to Brad. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone sharp. Brad hesitated, his confidence wavering under the manager's scrutiny. "I was just trying to manage expectations," he said weakly, avoiding eye contact. "Manage expectations," the manager repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Your job is to provide excellent service to every customer who walks through that door, not to make snap judgments about them. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Brad mumbled, his shoulders slumping. The manager turned back to Henry, his expression softening. "I apologize for my employee's behavior," he said. "It's unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed. If there's anything I can do to make up for this, please let me know." Henry nodded slowly, appreciating the apology but still feeling the sting of the earlier insults. "Thank you," he said simply. "All I want is to be treated with respect." As the manager escorted Brad away, the tension in the room began to dissipate. But for Henry, the experience left a lingering question: why did he have to fight so hard for something that should have been given freely, basic respect? As the manager led Brad away, Henry stood in the middle of the showroom, the echoes of the confrontation still resonating in his mind. The room had grown quieter, but the weight of the stares remained. Though some customers turned away, embarrassed to have witnessed the exchange, others still glanced his way, their expressions tinged with curiosity or disbelief. David stayed by Henry's side, a steadying presence amidst the unease. "You handled that well," David said, his voice calm but encouraging. "You didn't let them get to you." Henry gave a small nod, but his shoulders remained tense. "I didn't come here to fight," he said quietly. "I came here to make a dream come true. But it feels like no one in this room wants to see that happen." David placed a reassuring hand on Henry's back. "You don't need their approval," he said. "You've already proven your worth through everything you've done to get here. Don't let their ignorance make you doubt yourself." Henry sighed, his gaze drifting back to the jet he'd been admiring. The sleek aircraft gleamed under the showroom lights, a symbol of the years of hard work and perseverance that had brought him to this moment. It wasn't just a plane, it was a testament to everything he had overcome. From the back-breaking labor on the farm to the sacrifices he'd made to provide a better future for his family. Yet, standing here now, surrounded by wealth and privilege, Henry couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. The comments, the stares, the outright disdain, they all seemed to challenge his right to dream big. David noticed the flicker of doubt in Henry's eyes and stepped forward. "Why don't we speak with another salesperson?" he suggested. "There must be someone here who can help us without an attitude." Henry hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Let's try," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. They approached a young woman standing near the reception desk. Her name tag read Sophia, and she appeared hesitant as they approached. David was the first to speak. "Excuse me. We'd like to inquire about the specifications and pricing of this jet," he said, motioning toward the aircraft Henry had been inspecting. Sophia's eyes flicked to Henry, her professional smile faltering for just a moment before returning. "Of course," she said, though her tone carried a hint of hesitation. She stepped forward, pulling out a tablet to access the jet's details. "This model is designed for efficiency and comfort. It has a range of 3.000 miles and can seat up to 8 passengers. The base price starts at $3.5 million, though customization options can raise the cost significantly." As Sophia spoke, Henry listened intently, asking questions about the jet's features and performance. Despite her initial hesitation, Sophia gradually seemed to warm up, her responses growing more detailed and professional. David chimed in occasionally, helping to steer the conversation and keep the focus on Henry's interest in the plane. But as they discussed the jet, the tension in the room hadn't entirely dissipated. Across the showroom, Greg had reappeared, his expression a mix of irritation and resentment as he watched Sophia engage with Henry and David. He leaned against the counter, muttering something to a colleague, who glanced over at Henry and stifled a chuckle. Henry noticed the glances but chose to ignore them, focusing instead on the conversation with Sophia. He asked about maintenance costs, financing options, and delivery timelines, his questions revealing a deep understanding of what it took to own and operate a jet. With each inquiry, he felt a bit of his confidence returning, bolstered by the knowledge that he was more prepared than anyone in this room might have assumed. As the conversation continued, a small group of customers began to gather nearby, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected turn of events. Some whispered among themselves, while others openly stared at Henry, as if trying to reconcile his unassuming appearance with his apparent intent to purchase a multi-million-dollar aircraft. David noticed the growing attention and leaned closer to Henry. "You're doing great," he said softly. "Just keep being yourself. They'll see soon enough." Henry nodded, grateful for David's unwavering support. He turned back to Sophia, who was explaining the jet's customization options. "And if I wanted to add extra seating or modify the interior design?" he asked. Sophia hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to the gathering crowd before returning to Henry. "We can certainly accommodate those requests," she said. "I can connect you with our design team to discuss the details further." Henry nodded thoughtfully, his mind racing with possibilities. This was more than a transaction for him, it was the culmination of years of dreaming and striving. Yet, as he stood there, he knew that the hardest part of this journey wasn't financial, it was overcoming the barriers of prejudice and doubt that others had placed in his path. Nearby, Greg's muttering grew louder, catching the attention of a few customers. "I bet he's just wasting her time," Greg said, his voice carrying across the showroom. "He probably can't even afford a down payment." The words hit Henry like a cold wind, but he refused to let them break his composure. He straightened his shoulders, meeting Greg's gaze with quiet determination. "I've heard enough," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Let's finalize this." Sophia blinked in surprise, and even David looked momentarily taken aback. "You're ready?" Sophia asked, her voice hesitant. Henry nodded. I've been ready for this moment for years, he said. Let's get started. The room fell silent as Sophia led Henry and David toward the sales office. Behind them, Greg's smirk faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. The other customers watched in stunned silence, their assumptions and prejudices shattered in an instant. Henry walked forward with a quiet dignity, knowing that this moment wasn't just about buying a plane, it was about reclaiming his worth and proving that no dream was beyond his reach. As Henry followed Sophia toward the sales office, the whispers behind him seemed to fade into the background, like a distant hum. He no longer cared about the judgmental stares or the condescending remarks that had clouded the earlier moments of his visit. All that mattered now was moving forward. David walked beside him, his presence a steadying force. This is your moment, David said quietly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Make it count. Henry nodded, his resolve hardening with every step. When they reached the office, Sophia gestured toward a sleek glass table surrounded by leather chairs. Please have a seat, she said, her tone more professional now, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. Henry sat down, his hands resting on the table's polished surface. He took a deep breath, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a declaration of everything he had worked for. A rebuttal to every doubter and detractor who had tried to belittle his ambition. Sophia opened her tablet, her fingers tapping the screen as she pulled up the necessary documents. Before we proceed, she said, I'll need some information to complete the preliminary paperwork. Name, address, and preferred method of payment. Henry met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. Henry Carter, he said, his voice steady. He listed his address, a sprawling farm in the heart of Georgia, and then added, payment will be made in full, by check. Sophia's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise. Very well, Mr. Carter, she said, entering the details into her tablet. Once the paperwork is complete, we'll proceed to finalizing the purchase. As Sophia worked, David leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. You've handled this with more grace than most people would, he said, his voice low. I'm proud of you, Henry. Henry offered a faint smile. It's not about grace, he said. It's about knowing my worth. I've spent too many years proving myself to people who thought I didn't belong. I won't waste another minute trying to convince them. Meanwhile, back in the showroom, Greg was pacing near the display counter, his expression dark and brooding. He cast glances toward the office, where Henry and Sophia sat and muttered under his breath. This has to be a joke, he said to no one in particular. There's no way he's serious. A few customers nearby exchanged looks, their earlier disdain replaced by uncertainty. One woman, elegantly dressed in a designer suit, spoke up. If he's bluffing, he's taking it awfully far, she said, her tone less condescending than before. Maybe we underestimated him. Greg scoffed, his frustration evident. People like him don't buy jets, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. They don't belong here. But even as Greg tried to cling to his prejudice, the reality of the situation was becoming harder to ignore. The quiet confidence Henry exuded, the way he carried himself, it all hinted at a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Back in the office, Sophia finished entering the initial details and looked up at Henry. Everything looks good so far, she said. We'll just need your signature on a few documents to proceed. Henry nodded, picking up the pen she offered and carefully signing where indicated. Each stroke of the pen felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming his dignity and achieving his dream. As the final signature was placed, Sophia smiled, a genuine warmth creeping into her expression. Congratulations, Mr. Carter, she said. You've just taken the first step toward owning your aircraft. Henry allowed himself a small smile. Thank you, he said simply. David leaned forward, his grin widening. So, when's the delivery date? he asked, his tone light but filled with genuine excitement. Sophia glanced at her tablet. Typically, it takes about 6 weeks for customization and delivery, she said. But we'll do our best to expedite the process. Henry nodded. That works for me, he said, as they stood to leave the office. Sophia extended her hand. It's been a pleasure working with you, Mr. Carter, she said. Henry shook her hand firmly. The pleasure's mine, he replied. When they emerged from the office, the atmosphere in the showroom had shifted. The whispers had grown quieter, and the stares were less pronounced. Even Greg, who had been so vocal earlier, seemed to shrink into the background, his smirk replaced by a sullen scowl. Henry walked past him without a second glance. His head held high. David fell into step beside him, his grin as bright as the sunlight streaming through the showroom's glass walls. You did it, he said, clapping Henry on the back. You showed them all. Henry smiled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. I didn't do it to show them, he said. I did it for me, for everything I've worked for, and for everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. As they reached the exit, Henry paused and turned back, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. The luxury jets gleamed under the lights, and the people who had doubted him now stood in silence. It wasn't triumph he felt, but something deeper, a quiet resolve to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. He stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun, a sense of peace settling over him. This was only the beginning, he knew, but it was a beginning he had earned. And as he climbed into his truck, David by his side, Henry allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Because today, he hadn't just bought a plane, he had reclaimed his voice, his worth, and his right to dream. Henry and David drove away from the airport showroom in silence, the hum of the truck's engine a steady backdrop to their thoughts. The tension of the day lingered, but so did the weight of Henry's small victory. He hadn't just purchased a plane, he had stood tall in the face of prejudice, refusing to let anyone dictate his worth. As they approached the outskirts of the city, David broke the silence. You know, he said, his voice thoughtful, what you did back there wasn't just about you. It was bigger than that. Henry glanced at him, one hand on the wheel. Bigger than me? He asked, raising an eyebrow. David nodded. Think about it. How many people out there have dreams like yours but are too scared to chase them because of people like Greg? You just showed them it's possible. That no one has the right to tell them they don't belong. Henry mulled over David's words as they passed fields of golden wheat stretching out under the afternoon sun. He thought of his own journey, decades of hard work, saving every penny, and enduring countless moments where he'd felt like he didn't belong. But every step, every struggle, had brought him to this moment. They reached the farm just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the land in a warm, golden glow. Henry's wife, Grace, stood on the porch, her hands resting on her hips, a mixture of curiosity and concern on her face. Their 2 children, Emma and Noah, peeked out from behind her, their faces lighting up when they saw the truck pull in. Henry stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. Grace walked up to him, her eyes scanning his face. Well, she asked, her voice soft but insistent. How did it go? Henry gave her a small, weary smile. I got it, he said simply. Grace's expression shifted from worry to pride, a smile spreading across her face. She reached up and placed a hand on his cheek. I knew you would, she said. You always do. Emma and Noah ran up, their youthful energy breaking through the heavy mood. Dad, did you really buy an airplane? Emma asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Henry knelt down, pulling both kids into a hug. I did, he said, his voice warm. And one day, you're going to fly in it with me. As the family gathered on the porch, David leaned against the truck, watching them with a faint smile. Grace motioned for him to join them. David, come inside, she said. You've been with Henry through this whole thing. The least we can do is feed you. David chuckled and followed them into the house. The aroma of Grace's cooking filling the air. They sat around the dining table, sharing stories and laughter. The events of the day slowly fading into the background. But as the evening wore on and the kids were sent to bed, the conversation turned more serious. Grace looked at Henry, her brow furrowed. "What happened there?" she asked. "You don't look like a man who just made his dream come true." Henry sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "They didn't think I belonged. They judged me the second I walked in the door. If it weren't for David and Sophia, one of the employees who actually treated me with respect, I don't know if I could have gone through with it." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "But you did," she said. "You proved them wrong." Henry nodded. But his gaze was distant. "It's not just about proving them wrong," he said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. I want our kids to grow up in a world where their worth isn't questioned because of how they look or where they come from." David, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "And that's exactly what you're doing, Henry. You're setting an example for your kids, for the people in that showroom, and for anyone else who's ever been told they don't belong." Henry's eyes softened as he looked at his friend. "Thanks, David," he said. "That means a lot." As the night deepened and the farm grew quiet, Henry sat on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He looked out at the vast expanse of land he had worked so hard to build, the stars above reminding him of the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to truly feel the magnitude of what he had accomplished. He hadn't just bought a plane, he had taken a stand. Against prejudice. Against doubt. Against anyone who had ever tried to tell him he couldn't. And in that moment, Henry knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long. But he was ready for it. With his family by his side and his dream now within reach, there was nothing he couldn't achieve. The weeks following the incident at the airport showroom were a whirlwind for Henry and his family. News of what had transpired spread quickly through the local community and beyond. What had started as a simple attempt to purchase a plane had become a story of perseverance, dignity, and justice. At first, Henry wasn't sure how to feel about the attention. Journalists came to the farm, asking for interviews and trying to capture the essence of his story. Some painted him as a hero, a symbol of resilience against discrimination. Others focused on the systemic issues revealed by the behavior of the showroom staff. Henry, ever modest, chose his words carefully during these interviews. "I didn't set out to make a statement," he told one reporter. "I just wanted to fulfill a dream I've had for years. But if my story can inspire others to stand up for themselves, then I'm grateful for that." The story struck a chord with people from all walks of life. Letters began arriving at the farm, some from strangers offering their support. Others sharing their own experiences with prejudice and how they overcame it. Grace would read these letters aloud in the evenings, her voice filled with emotion as she shared the heartfelt words of encouragement. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a young man named Elijah, who lived in a nearby city. He wrote about how he had always dreamed of starting his own business but had been held back by self-doubt and fear of rejection. "Your story reminded me that no one has the right to tell me what I can or cannot do," Elijah wrote. "I've decided to take the leap. And I owe that courage to you." Henry read the letter over several times, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "It's incredible," he said to Grace, his voice soft. "I never thought what I went through could mean so much to someone else." Grace smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've always been an inspiration, Henry. Now the world sees it too." Meanwhile, David was working behind the scenes to address the larger implications of what had happened at the showroom. He encouraged Henry to pursue legal action, not out of revenge but as a way to hold the company accountable and push for systemic change. After much consideration, Henry agreed. With David's help, Henry partnered with a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases. Together, they built a strong case against the company, focusing not only on the treatment Henry had endured but also on the broader issue of discrimination in professional spaces. Patricia, the employee who had secretly recorded the mocking comments, agreed to testify. Her courage added weight to the case, demonstrating that even within the company, there were people who recognized the need for change. The trial garnered significant public attention. Supporters of Henry's cause filled the courtroom, their presence a powerful reminder that this was about more than one man's experience. It was about challenging a culture that allowed such behavior to persist. During his testimony, Henry spoke with quiet strength. "I've spent my life working hard," he said, his voice steady. "I've built something out of nothing. And I've done it with integrity. When I walked into that showroom, I wasn't looking for approval. I was there to achieve a dream. But what I encountered wasn't just about me, it was about how we, as a society, treat people based on assumptions and prejudice. That has to change." The judge listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When the verdict came, it was a victory not just for Henry but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment. The company was ordered to pay substantial damages and implement mandatory anti-discrimination training. More importantly, the case sent a clear message that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. After the trial, Henry and his family returned to the farm, where life slowly began to regain its rhythm. Yet, something had shifted. The farm, once a quiet refuge, had become a symbol of hope and resilience for countless others. Visitors stopped by to share their gratitude or simply to shake Henry's hand. The once isolated farmer had become a beacon of change. One crisp autumn morning, as Henry stood in the barn repairing a piece of equipment, Marcus, his eldest son, approached. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice filled with admiration, "I hope you know how proud we all are of you." Henry looked up, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "Your mom, your Uncle David, and even people I'd never met before, they all stood by me. That's what made the difference." Marcus nodded, his eyes gleaming with respect. "Still, you led the way." Later that day, as Henry watched his family gather around the dinner table, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. He had not only fulfilled his dream but had also sparked a movement that would continue long after him. And as the sun set over the fields, casting a golden glow across the land, Henry knew one thing for certain: no matter the challenges, dignity and determination would always prevail. As the sun set over the rolling fields of Henry's farm, a sense of peace and fulfillment enveloped him. The journey had been challenging, but it proved that dignity, perseverance, and courage could triumph over prejudice and adversity. With the unwavering support of his family and community, Henry not only achieved his dream but became a symbol of resilience and hope for countless others. This story is a reminder that our worth is not determined by others' judgments but by our own belief in ourselves. Henry's journey teaches us to stand tall in the face of injustice and to fight for what we deserve. If this story inspired you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful tales that touch the heart and remind us of life's profound lessons. See you in the next story.